Thank you for listening to Footnotes, a Fellowship Mosaic podcast. This is a space for us to dig deeper into Scripture, what is happening in our community and culture, and continue the conversations we start on Saturday nights. We're excited to have you join us as we pursue truth, holiness, and redemption together.
Well, hey, welcome back to Footnotes, our Fellowship Mosaic podcast, where we just follow up to the sermons from the previous week and talk about the things that either we didn't have time to get to, or there's room for more depth and follow-up. And so this is Nick, and I'm joined here with Mr. Matt Natzel.
Hello, hello.
Hey. Hey, Matt, you taught on the second half of 1 Corinthians 14 this past weekend, which is all about kind of structure and order in the worship gathering. So tell us about it. What were the big points and where you're still wrestling?
Yeah, so this is kind of the conclusion of his spiritual gifts chunk of 1 Corinthians. He's been in a couple chapters worth of really arguing for the gifts being don't elevate the gifts as something more important than they are. Submission to Jesus is the ultimate thing, and then don't undervalue the gifts. They're something God's giving his people to steward one another well and treat one another well. And so if you can bring your gifts well on behalf of the body, what you're going to need to do is bring some peace and some order in the structure of service as you gather, in order for there to be room for all the gifts that the Lord gives. And for the most part, the passage is a pretty straightforward wrestle with: do you have the gifts? Are you overvaluing them? Don't. Are you undervaluing them? Don't. Are you pushing yourself in front of somebody else to make room for your thing and push somebody else aside? Don't. And I think that's the part of the passage that everybody's like, okay, yeah. And if it had been that alone, I don't think I would have been getting texts Saturday night and Sunday morning saying, hey, follow-up question, what do you do about this? Or, hey, you almost touched on this and then you didn't. Could you tell me that? And so the big question space is verses 34 and 35, which say, women should remain silent in the churches. They're not allowed to speak, but must be in submission, as the law says. If they want to inquire about something, they should ask their own husbands at home, for it is disgraceful for a woman to speak in the church. And we brought that forward. The kind of route that I chased on this one was digging into the word submission there in the middle of the context, saying he's used this word already, just in encouraging prophets to subject their spirits to their own control, in encouraging women to submit and subject themselves to the order of service and to not speak in that space. And we also talked about some conflict with previous things Paul said. We didn't pick up ways that this might sound like other passages. Paul has said other hard things and about women and their roles in the church, and other places where he's said things that seem contradictory to this. So there's kind of a big, robust conversation there that feels timely. I think it is one of the conversations in Christendom right now. And I did get feedback, some questions Saturday, Sunday from especially some of the young adults. Go out to dinner every Saturday night. So they texted a list of things like, here's everything that came up at dinner. Are you guys doing a Footnotes this week? And I said, well, we absolutely can. So we also, we're going to get a chance in a minute to listen to our first listener question.
Ooh.
I had somebody record a voice memo and send it to me. And I if it works well this time, I think this is something I want to do in the future as well. We're kind of planning to get to the other side of Easter, of spring break, and maybe pre-Easter, and get Mark Schatzman in here and kind of dig into a more robust unpacking of complementarianism and what are we doing and how have we arrived there and what does that mean. But for the conversation today, one part of the sermon had been that I gave a little peek behind the curtain of how does the planning process work? How does a sermon get shaped by us? What's evaluation look like? And we did evaluations Monday morning, and Nick had some feedback, and he was like, hey, I think you did a great job, and I think I longed for us to go to this piece, and you didn't get there. And I said, that makes sense. And I sort of had the curiosity of you heard what I did with the passage. if you were doing this passage, where did I go big that you would have said, I would have brushed past that or just, made a one sentence acknowledgement? And where did I say little that you would have maybe said much? Kind of any thoughts there?
I mean, yeah. And I think one of the things that I'm really thankful and excited to jump to the question, because one of the things that's really hard about preaching, you talk about this a lot in writing, you don't get dialogue. And so one of the reasons I love the classroom so much is it's always so helpful for me when I say a sentence, when someone in the room says, hey, I hear you saying this. Is this what you're saying? And I'm able to go, no, that's not what I'm saying. Thank you. Let's try again. And oftentimes, like a lot of my family member are teachers, and my mom as a math teacher would say, like, she has like 6 ways to explain every concept. So she always leads with the one that she thinks has the best chance of landing with the students.
That's good.
But she knows she's going to have to, like, she's going to teach it, and then she's going to check for understanding. Yep. And when there isn't understanding, she's going to go to approach 2 and sometimes approach 3, 4, 5, 6. And so you don't get that in a sermon.
Sure.
You have to go with approach 1, and that's it.
Yep.
And then you go back around. And so, I thought the way that you approach things was really good. And like on the women remain silent, the point that you made that I thought was maybe the most important, and the one that I would want to just beat the drum on, is remain silent is in a context where he's told 2 other ways people need to be silent.
Yeah.
And in both of those other ways, they are not being told to be silent all the time.
Yeah.
They're saying, you people who have a speaking role in the church, this is the moment where you stop talking and let other people speak.
Yeah.
And so I think that is key for understanding the tension you brought up between 1 Corinthians 14 and 1 Corinthians 11.
Yeah.
This is not a women always remain silent. This is in the context of the other. The example I've used on this silence verse in the past is when a teacher walks into a room and it's time to get started and everybody's chattering. She says, okay, everybody be quiet. It's time to get started. The teacher is not issuing a once for all command. We don't speak in this class.
Yeah.
She's saying, I need you to stop speaking for a minute so I can say something.
Yeah.
And that is, I think, the essence of the be quiet in chapter 14, is people who in general are going to be speaking. There is a moment where you stop speaking so you can listen to someone else who has the floor.
Yeah.
So the question becomes, in verses 34 and 35, apparently Paul is telling women to stop speaking for a moment because someone else has the floor.
Yeah.
So who is the someone else who has the floor? And what are they saying that gives them the floor in this moment? Kind of, I think, becomes the key question in chapter 14.
Okay.
And my reason for even wanting to lean in more, I think you put all the right emphasis on chapter 14. I think the reason I'm feeling leaning in more is the same reason that you got text asking, is because the cultural moment for this issue is so big.
Sure.
And this question of men and women and their role in leadership and speaking in the church, it brings so many questions. It brings so much pain for a lot of people.
Sure.
That I think leaning in even further, and that's why we have the Footnotes podcast, is I think leaning in further is helpful. And so yeah, I think that's the moment to lean in and ask a lot of questions on, and give space for that. So
it's good.
You got questions sent to you.
Yeah, I did. Maybe before we get to that one, the non-recorded text, I got a text also from somebody else who said, you did a good job of rescuing Paul. And and sort of there was a lot of verbal gymnastics that I saw you doing, which I think just maybe starting the conversation there with you and I. Am I doing verbal gymnastics? Am I saving Paul or rescuing Paul? Or what would you... I had a reply, but I would be curious what your reply was.
Well, I mean, once again, it all depends on how the spirit in which it was said. We have, I mean, anytime you go, let's just stick 21st century. It's not even consider the time part. Anytime you move from one culture to another, you learn what it means to say something in one place and another, and how that lands differently. One of my favorite examples is in John chapter 2, wedding at Cana. Jesus' mother comes to him telling him they're out of wine. And his response, translated literally to English, is, "Woman, what is that to me?"
Yeah.
Which sounds like this just such sharp, shocking thing.
Yeah.
But in American English, looking at a female and calling her woman is a sharp, degrading thing.
Yeah.
It had none of those overtones.
Yeah.
In the first century Greek, it would be, I think, a more appropriate translation to get the heart of it might be something more like ma'am or madam.
Yeah. That's good.
And so what Jesus, like in the context, what Jesus was doing there was not degrading. What was shocking about it was actually formal and impersonal. So the shocking thing in Jesus' response in John 2 is not that he degradingly called his mom woman. It was that instead of mother, he referred to her as madam. So what he was doing in John 2 is not degrading her, but he is showing an odd distance.
Yeah.
That says, I'm not relating to you as son to mother right now. I'm relating to you more as adult rabbi speaking to a woman at a public event.
Gotcha.
That's the shocking thing. So I use that to say, are you rescuing Paul? In one sense, no, Paul doesn't need to be rescued. He's an apostle.
Yeah.
But in another sense, what you are doing is going, okay, this thing Paul said that landed one way, would have landed one way in the first century in Greek, lands differently in English in the 21st century. So we do have to, I would say you are translating Paul.
Yeah.
Is what I would say. And that's what we're often doing is we're translating culturally.
It's good. It's good. All right. I'm going to play it, but I think we're going to cut in a better audio so that I'm not just streaming from a text message into a voice microphone. But here's the first one.
Hey, so in this passage, I know that Paul is directly talking about and towards married women. And whenever we were reading it, I was thinking of what he believes a single woman, a woman who's not married, maybe doesn't even have a strong spiritual father to turn to. Who are they supposed to turn to for their questions and teachings and being shepherded, I guess?
That's good. So thanks, Hooper, for that. The one of the tensions in the passage that I had to leave on the table was back in 1 Corinthians 11, I had made a big point teaching through that passage that the word for man and husband is the same, and the word for wife and woman is the same, and context tells you how to translate which direction with those. And in 11, there's so few clues there that we really don't know if it's supposed to be wife or woman, husband or man. And here, I thought I would be helped by that, but the translators split the difference, and they stay with woman in the first and then go to husbands in the second. And I was in a kind of wrestling place, and actually cut a part of the sermon where I said, this is Nick's interpretation. He's going to hate me for calling it that. He'd be he's probably red right now in the face, annoyed at this. So I'm glad I cut it. But the wrestle that I was having is, this does feel unclear. And one of the ways you framed the decision-making in translation is there's a pressure not to put your thumb on the scale when it would be unnecessary to do so. And so in verse 34, it says women should remain silent in the churches. It's a public context, so we're going to translate the word for the public meaning. And when we get to verse 35, it says they should ask their own husbands at home. The home is the private context, so we're going to go with the word husband there. It could say wives should remain silent in the churches and their own husbands at home, or women and their own men at home. And I don't know that anything is lost there necessarily, but in our own trying to understand and be clear. One thing just contextually that's helpful about Hooper's question versus what we see in the culture in Corinth would just be the acknowledgement that we have singleness much later in life, that you would be able to remove yourself from the parental covering of I'm still a person in my parents' home. So you would have sparked out in individualism through college or trade school or employment or something like that, and not be your parents' kid in that way anymore. Would mean that you are single in a way that would be unheard of here. And so we will have basically every woman in the church is either submitting to a husband at home because they're a married woman, or they're single but they're there with their father. So they're going to understand the implication of the word man or husband probably for them meaning man, meeting dad. And they're doing that mental gymnastics in a way that we can't with having translated it and then being stuck with woman, husband, and having a totally different cultural context. So that's the background of the tension, I think, of the question she's asking. You want to take a stab at answering her question, or you want me to?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's the right question. I think you're right to highlight the cultural difference in the way singleness operates in the Western 21st century context.
Sure.
And really, actually, Paul's teaching in 1 Corinthians 7 makes that context even possible. Before 1 Corinthians 7 was written, there was no cultural space for a single woman who's not pursuing marriage. Like, that just did not exist anywhere in culture. That was just, every human culture assumed that you're a daughter under the household of your dad, and then you'll go get married and be under the household of your husband. That was just assumed everywhere. And so
I'm going to pull up that passage and just can I refresh us on that
Please do.
Where are we at here? The concerning change of status.
Yep.
Maybe starting in verse 8. Now to the unmarried and the widows, I say it's good for them to stay unmarried as I do. Maybe that contextual blessing.
Yep.
Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, absolutely. And so the whole idea of this is essentially, going all the way back. We'll talk about this in the marriage and sex and gender series coming up in April and May. But the understanding is, like, the purpose of humanity in Genesis 1 and 2 is to get married and start families. Like, that's kind of a central purpose that humanity's given in the garden.
Yeah, fill the earth and
subdue it. And so, like, family making is considered a core part of what humans are made to do.
Yeah.
And we're going like way off track here in some ways, but it is important.
Sure.
Eschatology changes things. So I mean the theology of the end. And Paul has this sense that we are living in the last days. Jesus is going to return.
Yeah.
So therefore, that kind of urgency says we can actually forego that purpose for the sake of the gospel. Like, living for reaching the unreached, reaching the lost, the urgency of the mission of the church makes that kind of settling down and family making optional.
Yeah.
And so he creates this space for a life of commitment to the mission of the church, apart from the idea of getting married and starting families and that whole thing as having a space. So that sets up this possibility.
Sure.
Of it having a cultural space. Apart from the family unit. And so the church begins to operate like a family.
Okay.
So they start calling each other brothers and sisters, and they start referring to their elders as fathers and mothers. And so one of the places I would point to would be Titus chapter 2, where Paul is actually specifically talking to these gendered leadership roles. And he says this in Titus chapter 2, verse 3, likewise, teach the older women to be reverent in the way they live, not to be slanderers or addicted to much wine, but to teach what is good. Then they can teach the younger women to love their husbands and children, to be self-controlled and pure, to be busy at home, to be kind, to be subject to their husbands, so that no one will malign the word of God. So even here, in older women, younger women, there's still the assumption that younger women are getting married, but there's a lot of thought around this idea of the older women. It is a female word for that we might translate elder. There is a lot of evidence that these were the widows in the church.
Okay.
So when, especially tied to 1 Corinthians 7, the implication seems to be you can, if you become a widow, if your husband dies, there's two paths forward for you of like where you fit in the family. You can remarry.
Okay.
And in that case, your home becomes the home of your husband.
Okay.
Or you can remain a widow and give yourself to the church.
Okay.
And if that happened, this is actually what we know from church history. What happened was, because so much of economy and everything was built around the family and the household and that sort of stuff, the widows took on this role of saying, hey, the church is going to help financially sustain you, and we're going to lean on you to mentor and disciple young women.
Yeah.
And that was like the role of these elder widows in the church.
That's cool.
Now, economically, we are in a totally different system right now.
Sure.
But I think there is a paradigm here for saying there is a space for these sage women, a term that we use around here a lot, sage women, who are the person that these younger women are looking to for discipleship and mentorship in the church. So that would be my first answer is like, actually that those people are there. And I would encourage you, like, lean into that, lean into those older women for your place that you're going to get discipleship. Like that's all being laid out there for you in the scriptures. But we do have to like tie some threads because all of these letters they're speaking to direct situations. And so we get these like couple of sentences that are speaking to something much larger. Nowhere in the New Testament do we get a handbook for how to structure a church.
Sure.
So we're like, when we try to produce that, which is what we're often doing, we are stringing together these different ideas from various places trying to make that fit.
That's good. I'm thinking about maybe another potential answer to this question would also be remembering that the context is the interruption in the church, the contradiction to prophecy in the church, that I've seen you a number of times have somebody up to the office with questions, and you're like, just how about you come up and we'll sit and talk for an hour, and I can try to answer every question you have. I can do a similar kind of thing. I've done that same thing. So in some sense, it might be, hey, if you and a group of people that you're meeting with keep coming up with the same questions and you're kind of stuck and you all want to grab time together, that would not be in the context of the church gathering an interruption. That would be you pursuing sort of it's sort of like not addressed at all in the verse, really. Right. It's sort of like, hey, yeah, you can be pastored at this church by someone and ask questions and be answered. So I think there is that piece also in play here as well.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true.
Well, she has sent a second question, and I'm watching the time here. We are going to be short on the actual time to answer it, but we can crack it open and maybe start down that path. And I do think that the big version of this answer will be the listener question heavy Footnotes special in early April with Mark and others. And
I hope that's the branding title right there.
Yes.
That's really good.
And you can throw, if you have suggestions of other additional guests, I'll listen to those. I'll probably ignore a lot of them. If it's my mom, I don't know. And just kidding. Mom, love you. All right. Hooper's other question. Here we go.
Does the Bible define a direct, clear line of what a woman's role in ministry is? Like, should women be baptizing other women? Should they be shepherding and teaching? And then like, what is that difference between like shepherding and teaching? That's something I've been super curious about and just wondering with the Lord recently. And I was just wondering if you have any answers or directions for that question.
That's really good. And so here's I'm going to give like my obnoxious answer. The obnoxious short answer is no, it does not. And yet,
no, it does not is the short answer for what part of the question?
For does the Bible give a direct line to define this?
Good.
But the other side of that is, and this is where I think we have to think about what kind of book the New Testament is. The Bible doesn't give a clear, direct line to define anyone's role in leadership.
Okay.
That's what's really hard. Like when you read the qualifications of an elder in 1 Timothy chapter 3 and Titus chapter 2, what's obnoxious is you don't get a job description. It doesn't say, elders, you do these 3 tasks and only you do these 3 tasks. Instead, what you get is a list of character qualifications to be an elder.
Okay.
Now, what's fascinating about that is that means that it seems like the work of the elder is left not clearly defined. We know generally there's something about shepherding and overseeing the flock.
Okay.
And there's something about guarding the doctrine of the church. Okay? So what we have instead is this general sense that the elders who are understanding of those qualifications, particularly in 1 Timothy chapter 3, is that the elders are to be men who are faithful in marriage to their wives and have several other qualifications that are seen there. That they are to have an overseeing role in some way in the church.
Okay.
Then there's a whole lot of questions of how do you divvy up the responsibilities between men and women in the body, and in what sense, what is that unique overseeing role of doctrine and guarding the church?
Sure.
And how does that translate? And then you have specific passages like 1 Timothy chapter 2 that we talked about in our 1 Timothy series a year ago. Paul says this in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 11, 12, and 13. A woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet. This is like what we said earlier. This is a specific quiet in a specific moment. And then Paul goes on to give his reasons. He says, for Adam was formed first, then Eve, and there's a big discussion there. So we have two passages sitting side by side. 1 Timothy 2:11 and 12 that says, I don't permit a woman to teach. Titus 2 that says, older women teach the younger women. So should women be teaching and shepherding? Yes. And at the same time, there seem to be some parameters about when and how they teach and shepherd. So what this leads us to, and we have to admit it's really complicated because the Bible doesn't give, like I said, a church handbook that defines these tasks and roles.
It's not Lego instructions.
It's not Lego instructions.
They're some of the easiest to follow, for sure.
So what we're told is that there are some parameters in which there are certain men, elders, spiritual authority figures, however we want to define that are giving some guidance, and then women are told that they are supposed to be exercising their gifts, and they are to be teaching and shepherding within some kind of shepherding oversight.
Okay.
What that means is every church has to figure out contextually in their culture how that gets expressed in a healthy way. Okay. What does that male oversight that we understand, and it's not just all men, so this is not all men are shepherding all the women, it is a select group of people that the church has recognized as their leadership.
Okay.
How does that male leadership get expressed, and how does female shepherding and leadership within that context get expressed? Okay. So where we have to be really honest is that we are trying to fight to define that in our cultural context in an appropriate way that is not one-to-one spelled out in Scripture.
Okay.
So I remember Jason McMahon, who's a basketball coach, he used to say that he'd always have this conversation with parents if they felt like he had drawn the wrong lines in cutting the team and deciding who was on the team.
Yeah.
And the way he would always say it was, he goes, I think we all agree that a certain number of kids have to be cut. Like you can't have a 200-person team.
Okay.
But where you draw that line is where the disagreement is. Yeah. You think as a parent, you said you feel like I drew it too close. You wish I had included two more kids and one of them was your kid.
Yeah.
And he would say, that's a fair debate. And like acknowledging like there is space between, I don't think anyone is saying, he would say, that we don't cut anyone.
Yeah.
But there is your feelings about like, hey, maybe that line shouldn't have been here. I think what I would say is I think for people who read the Scripture the way we do at Fellowship, we're going to agree within our context that there is some male shepherding elder role, and we're going to draw a line somewhere.
Yeah.
Of these are the things that this male spiritual authority role is doing, and here are the ones that are open to men and women both. And then what we might disagree on where that line is, and that's something that we have to admit we're contextually doing our best.
Yeah.
So the lines where I would, here we go, ditches time, my two ditches. One ditch would be to go, because we don't know where those lines are, chuck the lines.
Okay.
Let's just assume there are no lines. Since Paul clearly, he's saying something about men and women here, but we can't be clear where those lines are today, therefore let's just ignore them.
Okay. And is there a name or an idea that would that be maybe like an open egalitarianism, or is there a phrase?
You could say,
there?
My egalitarian friends would not argue it the way I just said it, because the lines aren't clear. Let's chuck them. Sure. They wouldn't like that expression. Okay. But that could lead you to an egalitarian position. Okay. Of saying let's not have any boundaries or lines between men and women in leadership. The other extreme, I think, would be to be completely rigid and refuse to acknowledge that we have had to make some judgment calls. Yeah. To pretend like we are just being like there is a one-to-one justification. And so like in the passage that we looked at this week, I would argue that Paul is in some way in 1 Corinthians chapter 14. He's going through this process of speaking in tongues, interpreting, speaking prophetically, and sifting that prophecy. And somewhere in that process, he has said women should speak prophetically. He said that back in chapter 11.
Yeah.
And now he's saying there's a time that women should stop speaking.
Yeah.
And so contextually, it seems to me like he is nodding to some kind of spiritual leadership for men in the gathered church that should be recognized.
Okay.
Now, can I draw a one-to-one line and say this is exactly when women should quit speaking, and this is the exact kind of activity that should only be for men in leadership? No, I can't do that.
Yeah. I
think we can say something like that is happening here, and we have to do our best to try to honor that in our cultural context.
Okay.
And so that I think is the middle that we land at. And so if someone comes and says to me, show me chapter and verse that says baptism is for men only, I can't do it.
Yeah.
I can't do it. I can say that in our context, we are practicing baptism as that process in some way of showing spiritual leadership. And so we have men in spiritual leadership baptizing in our church.
Yeah.
And I know churches that would not draw the line there, and I respect them and think they've got a good reason for not drawing the line there.
Yeah. That's good. I brought up the word egalitarianism earlier. I mentioned that we'd be doing a complementarianism episode. And in your drawing the line question, is there, I would assume that it's not just two camps. Like you're either this or you're that. I'm sure that it's you might be a really soft this or a really open, or I don't know what the words would be for those camps, but I'm sure there's a point where, similar to maybe the political discussion of I think I'm moderate, but my lefter-leaning people are you're a hardline right-leaner or hardline left-leaner or whatever. Wherever you're at, you would kind of. So is there a line where it becomes not one thing and yes the other, or?
Yeah, I mean, and within those camps, people fight for different. The labels are changing every couple of years because people go, well, I don't want to be associated with the people to the right or left of me, so I'm going to create a new label.
Sure.
So you could spend a whole podcast trying to figure out what the labels are. Broadly, I'm going to say there are two basic camps within which there's a wide spectrum. One camp says that there should be no distinction of leadership and roles in the church based on gender.
Okay.
That would be one camp. They say really that gender should not come into play at all in considering what roles of leadership we take. Traditionally, for the last several decades, that has been called egalitarianism.
Okay.
Then broadly, another camp would say, to some extent, there is a distinction between men and women in leadership, and there are some kinds of leadership in the church reserved for men. That has broadly been called complementarianism in the last seveal decades. So then,
is there a position past complementarianism that is the sort of caricature of that?
I mean, the curse word version of it is patriarchy. So that's what people, if you want to describe the complementarianism position negatively, some kind of male leadership, you're going to call it patriarchy.
Okay.
That tends to patriarchal view. That tends to be the word people want to associate with an extreme bad form of recognizing some kind of male leadership. But once again, no one in today's terms wants to be called a patriarchal position, and so nobody's going to willingly take that term on.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, so there's an acknowledgement here, kind of maybe to end or maybe to pause the conversation for the next time. There's an acknowledgement that the passage does feel hard, strange, foreign, complicated, and there is some. There are very likely in a church our size people who have been who have never given this passage a second thought because they've just been loved well, and when they've sought to serve their church somehow, they've found open doors and big thumbs up, and they've gotten to do everything they feel like the Lord has gifted them to do. And there have been others who have either come from a context where this was laid out differently or this was used differently. Maybe this verse, maybe a smattering of verses to say, we don't want you, or we don't value you, or you are a lesser image somehow because you can't do this or that, or some part of some door is closed to you. And so there's there are people in our congregation with pain or with hurt or with frustration. I just want to acknowledge that when we get to these passages, we could not pick a series on 1 Corinthians a year after a series on 1 Timothy, and we could not have to pick up the dicey passages, or we could do more swift overviews of books and just avoid complicated, hard things or touchy, sensitive things. But we know that you trust the Lord to be good, and you're around His people for that reason, and you're committed to this body, wrestling here with us, and we wrestle too. And I am grateful for. I don't know. I like I said Saturday, I have been leading a women's team or teams full of women for 10 years now. Kind of a lone guy in a lot of lady meetings and things, and I wholeheartedly trust their leadership. They are a gift to the church in the way they love and pursue and thoughtfully shape their ministries for their kids and communities, and they're deeply valued and empowered, and I think they feel that way often. So they might be some of the ones to bring in on this future conversation. So all that to say, we see you, and the questions, space for asking questions, wrestling with us is open. We care and want you to feel seen and heard and known and caught and shepherded through this. So, and man, God's really good. Like we're kind of into the weeds on church structure and dynamics of how to lead and what to lead, and addressing specifically the people that I knew asked questions through young adults. It was, y'all are like, you're doing the work. You're in the trenches, loving well. You're leading in schools and businesses and in our church, shepherding the next generation, caring for the generation, and one or two generations up from you. Our Sage people love you because you care well for them and show up for them. I mean, I hope it's just been yeses for you all the road along. But we're excited about more conversations ahead. And again, you can send in maybe just to mosaic@fellowshipnwa.org a voice memo with a question, and we'll collect those and do the best we can to try to order them. And if 3 or 4 people are asking same versions of the question, you might not hear your voice, but you might hear just the question answered. But I'm looking forward to that. It might be a test for how many people listen to Footnotes.
It's real.
Yeah, it's good.
Well, thanks, Nate. Thanks for shepherding us well through the passage, and thank you all for listening. And please do send in questions. We want to have that dialogue and continue to learn and grow together. Thanks. Be blessed. Have a great week.